The last decades of the Edo period and the first decades of the Meiji period are a time of great technical innovation in the arts. Color woodblock printing achieved technical perfection in late Edo Japan. It was indeed the most advanced color reproduction technique in the world up until the end of the 19th century and the invention of chromolithography. Spurred by commercial motivations, publishers, artists, and printers quickly adapted new colorants to achieve new effects and or lower the cost of printing. The taste of the public for bright colors matched fortuitously, or maybe was itself partly the result of, a series of innovations in color technology. These innovations either happened in Europe and were introduced into Japan as the country opened its borders to foreign commerce, gradually and in a limited fashion in the Edo period and more abruptly in the Meiji period, or happened in Japan itself. The introduction of Prussian blue in the 1820s and 30s is probably the best known example of a foreign pigment having a revolutionary impact in the art of woodblock printing. This blue pigment, bright and saturated even at full density, allowed printers to achieve a full range of tones, from light blues for the sky to deep blues of the sea, as seen in Hokusai's wave. We recently discovered another, more subtle change in materials that happened toward the end of the Edo period. The natural mineral orpiment, a golden yellow arsenic sulphide pigment traditionally quite expensive, begins to be replaced by a semi-synthetic version in the late 1830s and a fully synthetic arsenic sulphide after 1850. The new processes would have allowed pigment manufacturers to use low-grade arsenic ore to produce the costly pigment. Finding either type of the pigment in a print can allow us to date an impression to the Edo period or identify it as a later Meiji reprint. This is the case with the two sets of Hokusai's waterfalls, A and B, as identified by Roger Keyes, where set B, a Meiji recut, contains the amorphous arsenic sulphide. Our work on arsenic sulphide pigments is described in a series of publications in the open access journal Heritage Science. An area of great interest of ours, however, is that of organic colorants. These are complex organic molecules extracted for millennia from plants and insects, and sometimes shellfish, and used as dyes and pigments. Starting in 1856, with the rapid pace of development of organic chemistry, a new array of synthetic molecules becomes available to textile dyers, and with them, to artists and printers. Traditionally called aniline dyes because some of the early molecules were derived from aniline, a derivative of coal tar, these substances changed the world forever by launching some of the most important chemical companies and by eventually displacing the natural dyes. Technical manuals, academic publications, and catalogs of the period allow us to witness the extraordinary variety of dyes that became available in the second half of the 19th century and to study their dispersion across the world. A widespread belief among scholars and connoisseurs of the Japanese color woodblock print, Nishikie, holds that synthetic dyes were imported from the West in the 1860s and soon came to be used for all Nishikie colorants during the Meiji period. These, quote, cheap imported aniline dyes, end quote, are widely described as, quote, gaudy, garish, and strident, end quote, and thought to stand in sharp contrast to the more muted, quote, natural, end quote, colorants that preceded them. Surprisingly, not much has been written on the actual dyes used in the early phases of the Meiji period. Using micro-Raman spectroscopy, X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, and especially surface-enhanced Raman spectroscopy, a technique particularly suited to the identification of organic molecules in ultramicroscopic samples, we were able to accurately identify the early synthetic dyes used in a collection of precisely dated prints spanning the 1848-1898 period. You can see here, broken down in the various steps, the procedure used for analyzing ultramicroscopic samples from prints by surface-enhanced Raman spectroscopy. I should note that the samples are in generally smaller than the ones that you see depicted here, which are single paper fibers, a few hundred micrometers in print. For reference, the diameter of a human hair is 70 to 100 micrometer. This is the set of prints we used, and for a complete detail on the analytical techniques, the complete list with information on the prints, I remind you to the article we published in 2018 in the open access journal Heritage Science. For most of the Edo period and the very beginning of the Meiji period, the most important organic colorants in prints had been indigo and the pink to red dye safflower. Other natural organic reds may have been used, as well as another important blue, dayflower blue. Mixing safflower and indigo, or dayflower as in this print, was the only way to obtain purple shades. In 1864, the synthetic purple dye rosanilin became the first synthetic dye to be used in Nishikie. At first, we see rosanilin in combination with Prussian blue to give it a more bluish purple color. The pink hue of the dye is often most noticeable on the revents of the print, here on the right side of my slide, due to its partial solubility and greater penetration into the paper. Rosanilin, also known as magenta or fuchsin, is part of a family of dyes known as triaryl methane dyes. More than mauveine, the first synthetic dye, the triaryl methane dyes were the first truly successful synthetic dyes and became immediately ubiquitous in textile dyeing across Europe. From 1875, magenta was usually mixed with methyl violet, a group of closely related triaryl methane dyes, for a stronger purple. A purer version of methyl violet, crystal violet, is still in use today as a common ingredient in ballpoint pen blue inks. In early 1869, a dramatic and until recently unrecognized transition took place, from the long-standing use of safflower as the dominant red to its total replacement by imported Cochineal Carmine. Cochineal, a red colorant produced by the females of a coccus species insect, was discovered by early Mesoamerican populations and eventually domesticated. Exported in Europe following the Spanish conquest of Mexico, it became the most sought-after red colorant in textile dyeing and an important colorant for paintings. Carmine remained the primary red in Meiji woodblock prints for the next 2 decades, often combined with vermilion or iron oxide red, much as safflower had been earlier. In 1877, eosine, a bluish-pink dye, appeared in Nishikie. Eosine was used alone for pink and in mixtures with carmine for red. You can see in this print the pink of the cherry blossom is eosine by itself, but the red of the lady's gown contains both colorant, eosine and carmine. The same is true in this triptych, which is actually the triptych that started our study with the stunning discovery of eosine and Cochineal Carmine. Finally, from 1889, a succession of red Naphthal dyes of more striking color appeared. The Naphthal dyes, cotton scarlet, ponceau, and others, are very soluble and are often recognized by the fact that they bleed through to the reverse of the print and often in adjacent area. They were very cheap and afforded printers the possibility of lavishly printing in red, sometimes all over the surface. Just about this time, however, a tendency to more restrained use of color and more painterly effects began to emerge in Nishikie. and with the exception of a burst of dynamic color in prints depicting the Sino-Japanese War from 1894-95, the uses of strong colors in Meiji prints receded. Our study calls the traditional narrative that sees the imported aniline dyes completely substituting traditional colorants into question. The results of our analysis of the colorants of Nishikie prints, published from 1860 until 1900, show that the introduction of synthetic dyes was gradual and selective, and that most of the customary colorant of the late Edo period continued in use. To conclude, we should also absolve the Meiji printers of the blame of having used fugitive dyes. Not only light fastness was probably not a major concern in an industry whose production was, in large part, ephemeral, but the quality of the printing we see in most Meiji-era Nishiki-e is on par with what's seen in the late Edo period, notwithstanding the fact that Meiji-era master printers had to essentially discover, all by themselves, the properties of the new aniline dyes. And if artists should be blamed for using fugitive dyes, should we look differently at other masterpieces where eosiness faded, leaving once violet petals now blue?